The quiet lake looked peaceful that morning, but within minutes the entire neighborhood would be in chaos. One phone call from the HOA was about to start a chain of events no one could have imagined, and by the end of this story, the same people who tried to stop him from fishing would realize they had made the biggest mistake of their lives. Mark Ellison had lived beside Pine Ridge Lake for almost 12 years. The lake sat behind his house, shining like a mirror every morning when the sun rose over the water. For Mark, fishing there wasn't just a hobby. It was his routine, his peace after long days at work. But Pine Ridge had one thing that made life complicated: a strict homeowners association. The HOA board believed they controlled everything: the lawns, the fences, the colors of mailboxes. Even the small dock beside Mark's yard. That morning Mark sat quietly on his wooden chair, casting his fishing line into the calm water. Birds circled above the lake, and the neighborhood was still waking up. Then suddenly, a voice shouted from behind him, "Hey! You can't fish there." Mark slowly turned around and saw Karen Holloway, the head of the HOA, marching down the path with her clipboard in hand. Her expression was already filled with anger, and what she did next would trigger a battle no one in Pine Ridge ever expected. Karen Holloway didn't believe in calm conversations. She believed in rules, and when she saw Mark sitting by the lake with his fishing rod, her face turned red with frustration. "You're violating HOA regulations," she snapped. Mark looked confused. "Fishing?" Karen pointed toward the water like she owned it. "This lake belongs to the community. Residents are not allowed to use it for personal activities without HOA approval." Mark blinked slowly. He had fished there for years. No one had ever complained. Not once. But Karen wasn't finished. Within minutes she pulled out her phone and made a call that stunned everyone nearby. She called the police. Neighbors started appearing on their porches, watching the strange scene unfold. A simple fishing trip had suddenly turned into a public confrontation. Mark stayed calm while Karen continued speaking loudly about violations and community rules. Soon a patrol car rolled into the quiet street. 2 officers stepped out and approached the lake. Karen crossed her arms proudly, convinced she had already won. But when the officers began asking questions about the lake's ownership, the entire situation started to change, because there was something Karen didn't know, and when the truth came out, the HOA's control over Pine Ridge would never look the same again. The police officers listened carefully while Karen explained her complaint. According to her, Mark was using community property without permission. She spoke with complete confidence, waving her clipboard like evidence. But the officer finally turned to Mark. "Sir, do you have any documents about the property?" Mark calmly stood up and walked back toward his house. A few minutes later he returned with a small folder. Inside were several papers that instantly caught the officer's attention. The officer studied them quietly. Karen kept talking, insisting the lake belonged to the HOA. But then the officer raised his head and asked one simple question. "Ma'am, are you aware that this lake is privately owned?" Karen froze. "That's impossible," she said, but the officer pointed to the documents. The original land record showed something surprising. Years earlier, when Pine Ridge was first developed, the builder had quietly sold the lake property to a private buyer, and that buyer was Mark. The entire neighborhood had assumed the lake belonged to the HOA, but legally, it belonged to the quiet man who had been fishing there all morning. Karen's confident smile disappeared instantly, and what happened next would shock the entire community. The crowd around the lake grew larger as word started spreading. Neighbors whispered to each other in disbelief. The lake they had always called community property actually belonged to Mark. Karen looked stunned, but she refused to accept it. "This has to be wrong," she argued. "The HOA manages this lake." The officer calmly shook his head. "Managing something isn't the same as owning it." Karen's voice became louder. She insisted the HOA would challenge the claim and prove Mark was mistaken. But Mark simply smiled politely. Then he said something that made the entire crowd fall silent. "I actually tried to tell the HOA years ago." Karen blinked. Mark explained that when he bought the property from the original developer, he informed the HOA office, but the board ignored the paperwork. They continued acting like the lake was theirs. For years Mark stayed quiet. He didn't mind neighbors enjoying the view, he just wanted to fish peacefully. But now the HOA had called the police on him for using his own property, and that changed everything, because Mark had finally decided it was time to use his ownership rights, and his next move would leave the HOA completely powerless. The next morning Pine Ridge woke up to a shocking sight. A large sign stood near the lake entrance. "Private property, lake access restricted." Neighbors gathered in confusion. The peaceful community lake they had enjoyed for years was suddenly closed. Karen rushed to the site with several HOA board members. Her anger was impossible to hide. "You can't do this," she shouted. But Mark stood calmly beside the gate that had been installed overnight. He handed Karen a copy of the property deed again. I actually can. Karen threatened legal action. She claimed the HOA had rights to the lake because it had maintained the area for years, but Mark had already spoken to attorneys. The law was clear: ownership meant control, and the HOA had none. The police officers who had been called the previous day returned again to monitor the situation, but this time they were not there for Mark. They were there to make sure the HOA respected the property boundaries. Karen stood silently, realizing the entire power dynamic of Pine Ridge had suddenly changed. But what Mark did next would surprise everyone even more. Days passed, and Pine Ridge slowly adjusted to the new reality. The lake gate remained closed. Neighbors who once believed the HOA controlled everything now understood the truth. Karen and the HOA board attempted several legal meetings, hoping to regain access, but every lawyer gave them the same answer: the lake belonged to Mark. One evening, Mark called a small neighborhood meeting. Curious residents gathered near the gate. Many expected him to celebrate his victory, but instead, Mark spoke calmly. I never wanted to take the lake away from everyone. The crowd grew quiet. Mark explained that he had only wanted respect and fairness. For years the HOA had acted like authority meant ownership. Calling the police over fishing had crossed a line. Then he made an unexpected offer. Residents could still enjoy the lake, but the HOA would no longer control it. The community would manage it together with simple agreements. The neighbors immediately supported the idea. Karen, however, remained silent, because the power she once held over Pine Ridge had quietly disappeared. And the entire neighborhood had just witnessed a lesson no one would forget. Weeks later, the lake looked peaceful again. Families walked along the shore. Kids skipped stones across the water. Mark sat in his usual chair with his fishing rod, exactly where the story had started. But everything around him had changed. The HOA no longer controlled the lake. Neighbors had created a simple community agreement that respected both the property owner and the residents. Even Karen had slowly stepped back from her aggressive leadership role. What began as a small complaint about fishing had turned into a powerful reminder about fairness, ownership, and respect. Mark never planned to challenge the HOA. He only wanted quiet mornings by the water. But when someone tried to take control of something that wasn't theirs, the truth eventually surfaced. And sometimes the simplest action, like casting a fishing line into a calm lake, can reveal a much bigger story. Because in the end, the man who was accused of breaking the rules turned out to be the only one who actually owned the place. And that was the twist no one in Pine Ridge ever expected. And that was the final twist in this unbelievable HOA story. If you love the drama, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment sharing your thoughts. It really helps this channel grow.